welcome to the next episode of the University of Liverpool's Academy's Developing Practice podcast. In this episode, myself, Alex Owen, an academic developer, and Matt Davis, an organisational developer, sat down with Angela Saini, an award-winning science journalist, author and broadcaster, to discuss Angela's most recent book, Superior. This explores the existence of racism in science and how science is often used to support a certain position. We reflect on the impact of the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, on public awareness, as well as some of the reasons why people from Black and Asian backgrounds have been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. We hope you enjoy.
Well, we're really pleased to be speaking with you today, Angela, about the issues of race and science in particular. But before we get started, and we do this with every guest that we have on the podcast, we'd like to get a bit of a background story, a story about your professional background. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a science journalist now, and I spend most of my time writing books. I'm writing my fourth book at the moment. And the way I got into that was kind of roundabout because I studied engineering at university. And I had every intention of becoming an engineer, but I got involved in student politics. I was one of the co-chairs of the anti-racism committee in my student union, and that's how I started writing. So I started writing pieces for the newspaper, and I thought I'll give journalism a go because I found it such an important, personally cathartic, but I also thought an important way to get my voice out there. And I thought I can always fall back on engineering because it's one of those really good degrees that people still want to hire you when you have an engineering degree. And it worked out. And I think it helped that I came from a non-traditional background in terms of the media, because editors just saw me as different and, I had different things to offer. So I worked, I was a trainee at ITN, so I worked in TV news for a while. Then I went to the BBC, and I left the BBC for a number of reasons, but partly because I wanted to focus on science writing. And that was more than 10 years ago now. And since then, I've written 3 books, but most of my work focuses on this kind of issue around bias in science, what is going on behind the scenes of science. So really treating science as a journalist the way that a political journalist would treat politics, or a crime reporter would treat crime. That's the kind of approach I take to my journalism.
So did you go to journalism then primarily because you wanted to give a voice to those issues, or was it more of an accident than that?
No, I had things I wanted to say, and also I wanted, like most journalists, I think, to change the world and do good things and make sure that I was speaking truth to power. And it's very difficult to do that in journalism. But I feel I do feel I did that. I mean, I did do some work that I'm really proud of, especially just before I left the BBC. I did a long investigation into bogus universities, which really had a big impact. And I mean, the very first job I ever had in journalism was I moved to India for a while. India is where my parents are from originally. And I worked for a magazine there called Frontline, which is like a social affairs feature magazine. And I spent time in slums and covering stories of the very, very poor, so the poorest people in the world. And I started, I think, then to understand that there are most people living in the world have no voice whatsoever. We don't hear from them at all. 1, because they're not writing their stories and we're not hearing them. 2, because nobody wants to publish them. And 3, because many reporters don't have the time or resources just to spend time in those places and get those stories out. And that's, I think, vital. And some of my favorite writers now, I think, are those who get those stories out. I mean, there's a wonderful book I read just a couple of years ago, Ants Among Elephants, written by Sujata Gidler, who is an Indian woman who now lives in the US. She works as a bus conductor, I think, or a train conductor, I can't remember. And she wrote about her life as a Dalit woman, so a woman at the very bottom of the Indian social tree, an untouchable. And her family history, it's a memoir, it's a family history. And even though there are so many people that live at the bottom of society like that, we never hear from them. And it was so mind-blowing to me to hear firsthand a story like that. And so I try and, I think, or at least I have tried in my work, to give a little voice to those people you don't normally hear from.
Wonderful. And today we're hearing a little bit about your most recent book, Superior. And I understand that this book has built on your other book, Inferior, where you discuss the existence of sexism in science and how science is often used to support a certain position. So could you tell us a little bit as to why you decided to write your latest book, Superior, and what the main premise of the book includes?
Well, this is really where my career started. So, I got into this because of anti-racism in the first place. So these ideas have been turning over in my head for a very long time. I've spent like a large chunk of my life, including my childhood, thinking about this. And Superior, I think I was able to get it published at the time it was, partly because of the success of Inferior. I don't think it would have been picked up otherwise. But also because of the rise of the far right, populist politics, nationalism all over the world. There has been a noticeable uptick in the abuse of scientific data and very old-fashioned, outdated scientific arguments to make these racist claims, online especially, but it's also seeping into mainstream politics. So I think for myself, but also in service to that bigger political story, I felt I just had to get it all down. And it was really cathartic, because when you've been thinking about something for so many decades, you've been reading the literature, you've been turning it over in your head and thinking about it, to be able to get it down finally in one place and feel that I'd finally ordered all my thoughts around this topic, was a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, and a lot of that baggage of my childhood, in which there was a lot of racism in southeast London in the 90s. I can tell you that's where Stephen Lawrence was killed, not far from where I lived. He was around my age. And I felt like I finally put some of that baggage to rest. And I actually didn't, when it came out, I didn't care what anyone thought about it for that reason. I honestly didn't care. I was, with my other two books, I was really nervous about reviews. I didn't care with Superior because I felt I'd done as much justice to the topic as I could.
So was that the primary aim of the book, was in terms of a cathartic experience, or was it also about educating people and getting people to think about this key issue?
Well, my hope was that in holding people's hands, I could work my way through this topic, understand it for myself, but also help other people understand it in the same way. And the approach that I took was a very non-confrontational one. So I do interview people in Superior who, for example, are committed scientific racists who deny my equal humanity. But I had to do that because, one, as a journalist, I have to do that. I have to hear from all sides of that equation, but also because I wanted to understand this for myself. I really wanted to get the facts. I didn't start actually with the view that race wasn't real, if I'm honest, because I'd grown up with this idea and I'd internalized this idea that maybe there was something real about it. It was only by speaking to the scientists and understanding how the genetics and the mainstream science of it works, I realized that it wasn't. And that was quite an affront to my sense of self and who I was and what I thought. But I hope that the way I've written it will guide even those people who hold very different political beliefs from me through the topic in a way that maybe they will change their mind at the end. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I grew up, I clearly remember being told about those categories that you talk about in the book in terms of the genetics, and you explore that through the book. And I know we've spoken to Jess Wade, actually, who is, she organised a crowdfunding way of getting your first book into schools. Is that something that you're looking to in terms of Superior, in terms of getting the book into schools and educating people and breaking down what I was taught in school in terms of those categories of race?
Well, I have to say, Jess has taught me so much since I've got to know her. I have to say, I didn't know her before Inferior came out. She just kept turning up to my events, and I thought, who is this person? I thought she was crazy at the beginning, but then she's a physicist at Imperial. She's a completely respectable woman, and she's just taught me so much about the power of female support and female friendship. She's been in my corner all the way, and just incredible. And in fact, she did have a crowdfunder for Superior just a couple of weeks ago. She went out and she bought dozens of copies I think 50 copies of the book out of her own pocket, to hand out to people for free. And then she teamed up with the Newham Bookshop. At that point, my publishers gave 1,000 copies to Newham Bookshop to give out for free because of what Jess had done. And she crowdfunded for the postage. And we have well surpassed that target now. So they were giving away superior and also copies of Reni Eddo-Lodge's book, Why No Longer Talk to White People About Race. And they smashed that target, really, really quickly. And it was all her. She did all of that, and Newham Bookshop. And I'm so grateful to her for doing that. But I would love to see students read it. And in fact, a lot of those 1,000 copies have gone to schools.
She is amazing, Jess. She was a delight to have on the podcast, and she really did. She opened my eyes. I tell you, she was a great guest. So I'm really pleased to hear that she's now crowdfunding superior now, and she hasn't stopped. She'll never stop. She'll never stop, Jess won't. Obviously, we've seen the world respond to the killing of George Floyd in a variety of ways. Now, our own Vice-Chancellor issued an open letter where she stated, on behalf of the university community, that we've been horrified by George Floyd's killing. And she went on to say that as a university, we have not done enough yet, and we must do more. So it feels like there is an opportunity to respond. But what do you feel that response should be?
I think for each institution it's different, and the people within that institution are best placed to know what they need to do next. But I do think it starts with listening to BAME staff. I've met a number of people over the last few years who have left academia for various reasons, often because of harassment, discrimination, and universities just haven't been good enough at responding to that and dealing with it. There isn't enough accountability, and these systems, which are so hierarchical but run like businesses, yet don't have any of the accountability of normal businesses, I think is just, you cannot sustain systems like that. University staff everywhere are not happy. I mean, I don't know a single academic who is happy with their institution or with their jobs. And I think that's a product of these kind of toxic cultures that have been created, in which certain people are protected and looked after, others are thrown under the bus. There is very little accountability and responsibility at the upper levels. And the victims, the greatest victims of this, are the people who end up leaving. For whatever reason. So I think there is a lot that all these institutions could be doing. But the first thing is perhaps build in systems of accountability. So where do you go when you suffer harassment or abuse or bullying or discrimination? Give some people somewhere to go to that they know something will be done when they do. Yeah,
I agree with that completely. In my past as well, and the organisations I've been in, it's just not rigorous enough. So to summarise then, talk to our BAME staff, get that accountability. Is there something around, I mean, it's a developmental podcast, so is there something around self-reflection? I mean, I'm on a big learning journey with all of this at the moment. Is there something around that as well?
Yeah, and I think that's something for all of us. One of the positive things we've seen since the George Floyd killing has been people finally reflecting and reading and educating themselves. People who otherwise wouldn't have thought about it so much. And I think that's a really great thing. I think that's where it starts, and this is what I always tell people. And it's also a journey I go on constantly. I mean, my shelves are stacked with books that I have to read on issues that I don't fully understand yet, that I really want to get my head around. People whose lives I don't fully understand, and I think that's a lifelong process.
Absolutely, I think you're right, and I think this has given us an opportunity to have conversations. I know in our house we're having lots of conversations at the moment. We were watching the news the other day, and it was a news article about some of the statues being taken down, and my daughter, she couldn't get her head around why we would have statues of slave owners. So that's opened up really nice conversations that we've been able to have. I think you're right, it's all about talking and listening to each other and exploring these key issues.
And Liverpool actually has a very interesting history when it comes to race relations. I remember, so last year I did this documentary series on eugenics, and we did some filming in Liverpool, but we didn't use it in the end. And there was an actual lynching in Liverpool. And I really recommend all Liverpudlians learn about that history of the Black history of Liverpool, because it is fascinating and shocking, chilling, and it's part of the fabric of the city, I think.
Absolutely. We've got a brilliant slavery museum, which in my previous institution, which was also in Liverpool, I used to take the students down there, and we used to spend an afternoon there exploring that museum. Really important. There's so much history there. We know that people from Black and Asian backgrounds have been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic, both in relation to the likelihood of catching it and dying from the virus. And in your recent Lancet article, you write about the risks of grouping people by ethnicity in medical research. We have a large health sciences faculty. What would be your advice for our researchers in this area?
I think it's all about narratives, about how we frame the questions that we're asking. It has been really disappointing for me to see in recent weeks the issue of disproportionate deaths from COVID being framed in genetic terms and biological terms, as though there are innate qualities that certain groups of people have that would make them more susceptible, when we know that there are so many other factors at play here. And there always have been. There have always been racial disparities in health. It shouldn't have come as a shock that in the event of a pandemic, they would also play out in that same way. And yet it does seem to have come as a shock to some people within science, biologists and medical researchers. So I think a lot of work needs to be done there, and I would recommend we all start with looking at the social determinants of health and the various ways in which growing up poor, growing up with discrimination affects the body. These are profound impacts that it has. We know, for instance, in the US, there have been studies that show that being an immigrant makes you more likely to have hypertension, raises your blood pressure. Having more years of education lowers your blood pressure. I mean, there are so many kind of subtle ways in which health is affected by your position in society, and yet we overlook them because we live in this genetic age. We think that genes tell us everything about ourselves, that they are some kind of fatalistic blueprint for how our lives will turn out, which is why we so desperately turn to these DNA tests to tell us everything. Are we more like, what will we die of? What does my DNA test tell me? Well, actually, most people die of lifestyle diseases, like they die of heart attacks, heart disease, these kind of things that are caused by the way that they live. So I think we need to look more carefully at the way that we live rather than always jumping to this kind of genetic explanation for everything we see.
Absolutely. In your article, you said it's not groups of people that are different, but how those groups are treated. It's racism that kills, not race. And I guess that kind of summarizes what you're saying there. It's how we treat people rather than their genetics that's killing them.
Yeah, and it can play out in very subtle ways. I think a lot of people think that how is it possible that racism could make you more likely to have COVID? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But just think of it this way. We know, for instance, that if you live in more overcrowded conditions, which you're likely to do if you're an immigrant, or race overlaps heavily with poverty and overcrowding. So especially in a city like London, where the virus hit first, then you are more likely to be exposed to it. We have many more ethnic minority staff in the NHS, disproportionate numbers of ethnic minority staff in the NHS. So of course those demographic factors are going to play out. We know that your diet is different. So for example, Black Americans have higher rates of hypertension, not for any genetic reason I might add, but because they live in poor areas and their diets contain more salt, and salt is a big cause of hypertension. So there are so many tiny little ways, leaving aside racism in healthcare, which actually does exist, even in a system like the NHS, which is free at the point of care. Even then, there have been studies, and in fact, the British Medical Journal had a special issue just earlier this year titled Race in Medicine that was showing the discrimination that patients and doctors and staff face in the NHS. So these are real issues, and they have a cumulative effect. When you add together all these tiny little things, that is what causes these disparities that we see in society. So it's not, I think everyone wants a simple explanation. They want to be able to point to one thing and say it's that, but that's not how it works.
So, just going back to your past, Angela, can you tell us about your experiences of studying science at Oxford and King's College, and then working in the media as a science reporter, have taught you about these issues that we're discussing today?
Well, so I went to a state school, and I was the only person in my year to go to Oxford or Cambridge. What surprised me was when I got there were people around me the kind of people I'd never met before who had like 20 or 30 people at their school go to Oxford. And I thought, how is that possible that you went to a school that would send that many kids to this place? That in my school, there were kids who were so smart that they couldn't get in. Like really, really intelligent kids that couldn't get in. And yeah, it was so easy for you. And of course, they went to posh public schools and private schools. Um, a lot of my friends were state school kids as well. Some of them had quite tough backgrounds. I had one friend in particular who, my best friend in my college, who's still a very close friend of mine now, Bengali from East London. She went to a really, really rough school. She grew up in poverty. I mean, she told me recently if there was cheese in her fridge, that was like a luxury. That was a big deal in her house if there was cheese in the fridge. She was a carer for her dad. Her dad was very sick. And yet when she got to university, she was treated like everybody else. When she was out in the workplace, she was treated like everybody else. And I just thought, where is the equity here? I didn't grow up poor. I grew up in a middle-class family. My parents were immigrants, but I grew up in a middle-class family. But I just thought, what kind of system is it that doesn't take into account anyone's life history, that treats someone who's had every advantage, who's had tutors and gone to the best schools, exactly the same as someone who's had to care for her dad while studying? It's just not, there's no parity there. There's no understanding that academic talent, is not something you're born with. There is a component of that for sure, but a lot of it is about everything else, about all the other systems and structures around you that help you to get to where you are. And it is that, I think, that kind of idea plays out so much in certain sections of society. I mean, now, of course, I don't live in Southeast London anymore. I live in a really nice, liberal, leafy part of North London, and my son goes to a good school, and I'm part of that world that 30 years ago I didn't understand. I had to learn bit by bit. And my son, fortunately, is going to have all the things I didn't have growing up. He's, has people supporting him and giving him all the best of everything. And when you see the difference that can have, then you start to understand how many people are kind of left behind by this system that treats itself as though it's so meritocratic, as though it's so fair. There's nothing fair about it. I mean, the few people that manage to get to the places that they do, and we treat them as though they should be examples for everybody else, that everybody else should be able to do it. The reason that they got there is because they had to work really, really hard, and they had, something fortunate in their lives that allowed them to get there. So in my friend's case, for example, it was her history teacher who was just really, really supportive and fought for her and got her into Oxford. And in my case, it was my dad who just filled the house with books and gave me everything that I needed to get to where I needed to get. And I think these are the kind of things I think we need to appreciate about, when universities talk about being fair and being meritocratic. I think these are the things that they forget, that they're not. They were never this way, and they're still not.
Yeah, you're right. I think what you're saying there is that actually we need to understand people as individuals, don't we? And we need to have those conversations with people to hear their perspectives. And one of the aspects of Superior that I really enjoyed were the interviews and the personal experiences that you incorporated. And just as you're talking now, you're bringing in people's personal stories and to really help us to understand the key issues that you're talking about. And it's really made me think, how can we listen better to each other's stories and perspectives so that we can learn from each other?
Listening is, I think, the hard part, and even knowing what resources to get hold of in order to hear those stories. So I run a non-fiction science book club in London. I've run it since I went freelance, so it's more than 10 years now. It's been a really long time. We've read a lot of books, and we've recently tried to expand the literature that we read to works outside kind of the Western science canon, which is not easy because much of it isn't translated. It's not easy to get hold of. But one book we did find was The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. This is a kid who built, through his own ingenuity, his own skill, a windmill to bring electricity to his family and to his village in Africa. And what he describes in that book is, for a big chunk of that book, is the experience of famine, first-hand experience of what it's like to go through a famine, of being hungry yourself, seeing people die around you, not knowing if you'll get through it or not. We had never read anything like that, and I don't even know where I would have to go to find another account of that kind of experience. And yet this is something that millions of people around the world go through. They're going through right now. We will never know their stories. We never hear them. Our focus for the last couple of years has been on Brexit and now on COVID. We ignore that completely horrendous, life-changing, life-ending human experience of famine, because those are the stories we don't have access to. And I think that's the problem here, that these are things that we need to hear that we just don't hear, and especially firsthand. It's one thing to have a journalist go and cover a famine. It's another thing to hear from someone what it's like to be hungry, in depth, to hear their story in depth. And if we can, I think, try and seek out those stories, I think that's a really good place to start. To remember that the world doesn't end in Europe. There is a big world out there full of people whose lives that we can't even possibly imagine.
You've just triggered something with that storytelling. You told a story in the webinar that we just done, where a lady who really, really appreciated your first book, Inferior, couldn't relate to the second book. Sorry, this wasn't your second, actually. That was your third, wasn't it, by then? Superior, because she was white, so she couldn't relate to it. So there was a question that appeared in that chat, and I just thought that'd be really good to get on the podcast. So the question was, what are your thoughts on the interest convergence theory? And do you think this has played out in recent events in terms of the level of engagement that has not been previously seen with the Black Lives Matters movement from white allies? And do you think that can feed into tackling racism in STEM?
Well, I do. It has been heartening to see what has been happening since the George Floyd murder. If anyone read the interview that Renée Edo-Lodge did with The Guardian, because when she wrote her book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, one of the things she looked at was white feminism and this kind of willingness to stop your commitment to equality at gender and ignore everything else, or just say that as much as I care, I'm not going to do anything on that now because I'm too busy on this. And the price that you pay when you do that, I think the price that you pay is to accept that some inequalities are acceptable. And as long as some inequalities are acceptable, then frankly, you're never going to get any kind of equality. I don't think. You can't have equality just for some people. It's for everyone or it's for nobody. And I think that's the moral failing, I think, of certain justice movements, is this failure to recognize that pushing for rights can't be about gaining bigger sections of the pie just for your interest group. It has to be about understanding that equality will make a fairer society for everyone, and that makes the whole system work better. It makes the whole structure of society work better. I think it's a very capitalist argument to make that you want something first, or that there is only so much to go around, and that if anyone has to have it, then it has to be you first, and then you can think about other people. Injustice doesn't work that way. Oppression, I mean, this is the topic I'm writing on now. I'm writing a book on patriarchy, and you very quickly start to realize that all these systems are interlinked very deeply, completely interlinked with each other. There's no separation, even at their inception. And you just can't win any of these fights just focusing on yourself. You just can't.
Thank Thank you, Angela. That's been really, really helpful to support us in our thinking. The name of this podcast is Developing Practice Podcast. And we love to finish each recording just asking our guests for 3 or 4 take-home tips that the listener can reflect on in terms of their own personal thoughts or assumptions or practices. So just to end with, do you have 2 or 3 tips that we could just take away with us in terms of supporting us to think further?
Well, what I always say is try and, whichever field you work in, try and understand the history of that field, where the ideas came from. I'm always surprised actually at scientists I meet who don't even know the history of their own disciplines, and the phrases that they use, the language that they use. They have no idea where it comes from. So I would definitely start there. And if we can all lobby, if you can get behind me to lobby for mandatory inclusion of history and social sciences within scientific teaching, including engineering and including medicine, then I would really love that. If there's one thing I would really love to achieve before I die, it's just that. So please push for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, it was a pleasure to have Angela on the podcast. There were so many things that we can take away from that conversation and reflect on, and so many things that I think as an institution that we really need to start acting on, as was the call from our Vice Chancellor. Just one of the things that she said, and one of the things that I'm taking home, is how important it is that we continue this conversation and we continue listening to each other. It's crucial that we hear each other's stories and when we try to understand each other's perspectives. And to do this, we really need to hear people's stories that are different to our own.
I absolutely agree. That's the joy of this podcast, is hearing people's stories from completely different backgrounds to myself, and being able to explore some of their experiences with them so that I can then reflect on that and hopefully enhance my practice as a result. I think one of the things that Angela was saying about how if some inequalities are acceptable, then you never have any equality, that's something that's really profound and has really made me think about some of my practices and my thinking, that you can't have equality just for some people. Pushing for rights can't be just about your interest group. I loved what she said about equality will make a fairer society for everyone, and it will make the whole structure of society better. And actually, that's what in higher education, but in every aspect of society, we should be pushing for: equality for all, not just for the things that we're passionate about. Well, there's lots in that podcast that I know I will go away and think about, and I hope it's triggered some thinking in yourself as well. If you'd like to take your thinking further, we've linked to the various resources that we talked about in the podcast itself, and some further resources as well on the podcast in a podcast-specific reading list. You can access this at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. So please do check out those resources. We also love to hear what you think about the episodes of the podcast, so please do tweet us at Live Uni Academy, or you can tweet us direct at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen. We love it when you get in touch.
Yeah, and we are really grateful for those who have taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app, just as Gareth has done by commenting, "It's an excellent podcast with wide-ranging topics and interesting guests. I'm not in the HE space, but I am finding ways to apply the ideas in my industry and even my personal life." Well, thanks, Gareth. We are delighted it's bringing you so much value. So until next time, bye for now.